So what we're seeing here is on the left, there's a present day motor lifeboat, and then the disabled boat is in the center there. And this is kind of a cool video because you can see the perspective both from the air and from the water to see a little bit what these conditions actually look and feel like to surfmen and boat crews. What ended up happening in this situation is that they decided to deploy a rescue swimmer from the helicopter. And then this happened as the rescue swimmer was swimming over to the boat. A 25 or 30 foot sea break came and just ragdolled the boat. Oh, there we go. So I would be remiss though if we talked a whole lot more about the surfmen that operate motor lifeboats, if we didn't go back 150 or 200 years and talk about the surfmen who operated wooden or powered lifeboats and surfboats. So let's kind of take that trip back a few centuries. And ever since there's been commerce, there have been shipwrecks, right? And so as our country developed and grew, there increasingly was commerce, there's increasingly shipwrecks. And some of the first efforts to respond to the threat to life and property were kind of volunteer and small efforts. So the first, before we had anything like the Coast Guard, the first things we had were these different volunteer organizations. And one of the first ones that was pretty notable was the Massachusetts Humane Society, located in the state of Massachusetts. And by the turn of the 19th century, they had a few places where they had rescue boats stationed. They had equipment to shoot lines out to vessels, and they had volunteers who were willing to answer the call when a shipwreck came ashore. The other infrastructure at this early point in the country's history was what was known as the wrecking system. And it was kind of an interface with the insurance companies in the big cities where when a shipwreck happened, they definitely had interests in making sure that that the salvage was undertaken as completely as possible and that to ensure that fraud wasn't happening. So they designated individuals in some of the small beach communities up and down the East Coast as wreck masters. And these rec masters were responsible for essentially representing the insurance companies and making sure salvage and everything was carried out. But one of the things that they also did was work with kind of the ragtag local teams of people who would do the salvage and also the people who would kind of just volunteer to assist. And one of the relationships that ended up being built is that often the locals who would go out to assist people to save life during shipwrecks would end up getting these salvage contracts. So anyway, at this point in our country's history, 200 years ago or so, we had these early volunteer life-saving organizations and kind of the wrecking system as ways of organizing people to respond to emergencies. As the country grew and as big cities like New York and Boston, those ports became more prosperous, shipping increased and of course shipwrecks with it. And what we ended up with was kind of a situation where a typical winter or summer storm along the East Coast would make these wind-powered vessels pretty vulnerable to being blown in towards the shore into shallow water and the big waves that would break these vessels up and threaten life. And you can see the kind of the classic example here with the Port of New York in the red circle there. During a winter nor'easter or during a summer hurricane, with the winds out of the east and the northeast, these vessels would end up, aiming for the port, but often would get driven ashore either on the coast of Long Island to the north there, or on the coast of New Jersey to the south, and that's where they would end up in distress. And as it happened in 1839, where that red arrow is there, just a little north of Atlantic City, there was a New Jersey doctor who was out for a walk during a hurricane on the beach, and he happened upon the signs of a shipwreck. But because that ship was so far offshore and the conditions were, severe enough, he had no way to really assist. There was no way to get a line to the crew, and it was too dangerous to swim. So he basically had to stand by as the crew of 13 washed up at his feet dead. And as you can imagine, that experience really scarred him, and it actually impelled him to make a change. So over the next few years, this doctor ran for Congress, and he pushed pretty hard eventually to win the first federal appropriation that was actually spent for life-saving in the country's history. And so that first appropriation was about $10,000 for these early stations. There were 8 of them, and they were positioned in the northern part of New Jersey on the approach to New York. And this early system, again, the first federal money really to be spent for this, for life saving, consisted of these basic sheds, some basic life saving surf boats, and some equipment like lines and mortars and whatnot. And when these were all built, they turned over a key to some local who was deemed responsible, and then kind of just said, "Go do good things." And so for the next few decades, there were definitely cases where this equipment was put to use, and local volunteers who had experience with boats and in the surf uh, did great things. But there were also a lot of problems just because there was never really a system in place. There wasn't a set of regulations, there wasn't a lot of accountability, and there wasn't like enduring funding to maintain things. So by the time of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, this system had fallen into disrepair. And also at that point with the Civil War, the country's morals were kind of numbed to shipwreck concerns because of what was going on in terms of politics and warfare. So the system had fallen into disrepair, and there were a number of bad wrecks where literally a couple hundred people died because the equipment failed or there were other problems with this early life-saving system. And so by 1870, early 1870s, and eventually by 1878, the federal government really couldn't ignore the limitations of this system anymore, and the shipwrecks were continuing, the loss of property and life. And so a standalone service was established called the U.S. Life-Saving Service. And initially, in the early years, it still had volunteers, but by its kind of heyday, the service consisted mainly of a network of stations that each had a keeper and somewhere between 6 or 8 surfmen. And they had a bunch of duties. We'll talk more about that. But these surfmen officially were called surfmen. And the name, as far as we know, kind of comes from just the colloquial, there were boatmen, there were baymen, and there were surfmen, people who previously had made their lives, their livelihoods doing surf fishing, getting their boats out through the surf on these East Coast beaches. Because of how that system worked initially too, there were a lot of family ties in this early organization. So you had, fathers and sons that were involved, and also for the people who ended up staying in longer than just a few years, the people who made kind of a career of it, there was a lot of geographic stability. So people ended up working often within a very tight region, sometimes for many years. Now, this life-saving service, the whole system worked kind of on a standby basis. As you saw in that last picture, that was a surfman out on beach patrol, and that was a big part of how it worked. There weren't radios at the time, and it wasn't until later that there were even telephones that somebody could see a distress situation and call the life-saving station. So each night and during times of low visibility, the stations would dispatch a surfman to walk the beach. And their job was just to look for, signs of distress or even signs of ships that were coming in too close to shore. And as you can imagine, in the middle of the night in a blizzard or on a clear night, even when there was obviously no sign of distress and you could see for miles, some of the surfmen didn't want to always do the full patrol. And so eventually it got to the point that the service was concerned about accountability. And so they implemented this system of patrol checks. And this is an example of one of the brass surf checks or surfman checks that they issued. And after about 1880, every time a surfman went out on beach patrol, they were required to carry one of these and to exchange it with the surfman that they met at the halfway point with the adjacent station, so that in the morning, the next day, each keeper would have a record of, each of these different surfmen had in fact completed their patrols. The interesting thing about this is that the surfmen hated it. They felt mistrusted, and it was a pretty loathsome practice for them. We'll come back to it at the very end because it's an interesting thing how this has evolved, but I wanted to throw this in just to give you an idea of what the standby aspect of this system was. But as those surfmen on patrol would do their rounds, if they came upon a vessel that was either getting too close to shore, they could light off a flare and hopefully warn them to head out towards deeper water that was safe. Or they could light off a flare if the wreck had definitely come ashore and there was a legitimate distress. And that flare would tell another surfman in the lookout tower at the station, maybe farther up the beach, that the keeper needed to turn the crew out and get ready for a rescue. There's a couple different ways that these crews could do that, but we'll look first here at the beach apparatus. options. Essentially, what the keepers would do is they would get the crew together like this. They would have their cart and they would head towards the scene of the distress, which rarely was right in front of the station. So you can imagine having to take a cart like this up or down the beach in a blizzard, through sand dunes, literally for miles sometimes. And I will show a video here of what that drill looked like to rig this line up. The pole in the background there is supposed to simulate the mast of a shipwreck. So you can see these guys are setting up like a mini cannon basically to fire essentially like a clothesline out that then gets pulled in, and that pulls in a bigger line and a bigger line and a bigger line until a high line is kind of set up. It's kind of an interesting video too, because you can see there's some spectators who've assembled in the background. It was pretty popular when the life-saving crews were doing this drill in the summer in these vacation towns. And then you can see the surfman who's coming kind of down the zip line, if you will. He's in a breeches buoy, which is a life ring and a pair of pants. And this is what that would look like fully rigged up. It was a pretty robust method. It worked as long as the vessel was close in enough to shore that they could shoot a line out. And then also that the wind allowed that the lines that they were shooting out with the mortar were hitting the target and they weren't getting blown too far off. It was actually such a successful method too that the Coast Guard used this up until about 1950 occasionally. So it had a pretty good span of implementation, and it saved like hundreds and hundreds of lives, literally. But if the beach apparatus and the breeches buoy were not going to be effective, or if they tried it and it failed, the other option that these early lifesavers had was to take either a surf boat or a lifeboat out. And so I'll show you some pictures of what that looked like. Again, remembering that these are several thousand-pound boats and that somehow they had to get them up or down the beach, often miles distant from the station. So this is kind of the human-powered version of transporting a surf boat. But there was also horsepower, not just to pull the boats out of the water, but also to pull the carts to wherever they were going. And then in stations where they had deeper water, like a back bay or somewhere in the Great Lakes, eventually they were able to set up these marine railways where there was kind of a carriage system that launched the boat and then would store it over the rest of the time. Into the 20s and 30s, there was also tractor power. So eventually these boats could be brought up and down the beach with tractors. But regardless of the way that they were conveyed to the scene, the prospect of launching through the surf was the same. And this is a cool example of what that looked like on a calm day. But you can also imagine what this would have been like with overhead waves, 10 or 15 feet tall in the middle of the night in February. And so what you'll see here is kind of a coordinated, everything was by the numbers in the life-saving service. So you'll see that the surfmen kind of pull themselves aboard in a coordinated way, with the last aftmost surfman coming up last. And then in the back of the boat is the keeper standing up with the sweep oar there to steer the surf boat. And then they basically negotiate each line of breaks and head out. But this is a calm day. Like I said, it's probably 2 foot or maybe 3 foot kind of summer breaks, but it would be a whole different story in the middle of winter in a nor'easter. So this system continued to grow and expand and do really good work. And by 1914, the life-saving service had about 280 stations spread all throughout the country, between the East Coast, the Gulf, the Great Lakes, and eventually on the West Coast. And it was also diverse. Like each station was a little bit different. Like architecturally, some were different, but also functionally, there were stations that were located right on the beach, and so they would launch their boats directly through the surf that way. But there were also stations, like I said, that had those marine railways, and so they were located maybe in a port. There were also floating stations in a few places where it was essentially like a large houseboat that they could launch into a river from. And then in places with warm water that were low populated areas, there were a few houses of refuge that were kind of like shelter buildings with supplies, so that if a shipwreck crew came ashore near there, they would at least have some water and nourishment and a safe place to stay until someone discovered that they had shipwrecked. So I want to transition a little bit from talking about the service to talking about the boats that the crews used, and then we'll come back to talking about surfmen, because it's each of these pieces kind of says a lot about what the surfmen were and who they were and how they did their work and who they've become. And you can really trace the evolution of all of this by looking at the boats too. So this is an early lifeboat. You can tell it's a lifeboat instead of a surfboat because it has in the front and back those big kind of buoyant bulbous chambers that's just basically an air pocket to give the boat stability. And these lifeboats were self-righting, so if they were capsized, they could flip over. But as you can see from this picture, it also requires a little bit of help from the crew. And so this was a weekly drill that the life-saving station crews would do, where they would intentionally capsize the boat and then practice rewriting it. This is a similar type of lifeboat in use on the West Coast down in Central Oregon. And it's an interesting image because those are probably 8 to 10 to 12 foot breaking waves. And today, a motor lifeboat crew would go out in those same exact waves in the same spot between the jetties and do the same work. But these guys are 4 banks of oars and a keeper in the back taking a wooden oar-powered lifeboat across the river bar. By 1899, the life-saving service was experimenting with gasoline engines in their boats. And by 1915, 1920, the service was seeing more and more motor lifeboats. So this is an example of an early motor lifeboat. You can kind of see from the profile, it looks pretty similar to those other ones, right? It has the buoyancy chamber forward and aft, kind of a big open area in the back. But again, this one had a small engine in it as well. And then into the 1930s, that early version of double-ender motor lifeboat evolved a little bit further, got a little bit longer. And so in the foreground here is a disabled fishing vessel, also on the Oregon coast. And in the background is the next iteration, or one of the next iterations of motor lifeboats coming to its aid and trying to pull it off before it hits the rocks. This is the final iteration of those early double-ender wooden lifeboats. If you've ever seen the movie The Finest Hours or read that book, there's a really famous rescue, and it involves one of these wooden 36-foot motor lifeboats that served from those early iterations all the way up until 1980, actually, in the Coast Guard. And it's amazing to me because it's one of these early wooden boats. The craftsmanship is incredible in it. But it's still just a wooden boat, 36 feet long and a single engine. On a good day, maybe it could eke out about 8 or 9 miles an hour. In the 50s, the 1950s, these 36-footers started to become a little bit in over their heads in dealing with the larger fishing vessels on the West Coast that were also heading farther and farther out to sea. And so the Coast Guard took it upon themselves to design a new type of motor lifeboat with the new technology and new design features of the era to meet the demands of these bigger vessels that were farther offshore. And so they designed this 52-foot steel twin diesel engine motor lifeboat and built 4 of them to place on two ports on the coast of Oregon and 2 ports on the coast of Washington, where they spent about 60 years until recently when they were decommissioned, going out in kind of the roughest of the conditions for the biggest of the vessels that they needed to assist. But at the same time as those changes were happening, the wooden 36-footers, which were kind of the mainstay of the Coast Guard's fleet, they were getting obsolete and they were still pretty slow. And so the Coast Guard started in the early 60s designing a replacement for that whole class. And they came upon this 44-foot design, and it was like that 52-footer. It was steel, had twin engines, and for its time was really sophisticated, both in terms of the technology and components, and also just in terms of its design, its hull forms, and its stability and maneuverability. If any of you have ever been to the Maritime Museum in Astoria, Oregon. You'll actually recognize this boat because this is not only the same type of motor lifeboat that's on display. There's a big sculpted wave in the front of the museum, but this is actually the same exact boat. It's the 44300, which was the prototype for the 44-foot fleet. And in this picture, it's undergoing its early self-righting trials. So they're intentionally inverting it and then checking that it has the stability to rewrite itself. As you've kind of tracked throughout this progression, right, every one of these vessel classes that comes into service runs for a few decades and eventually becomes obsolete and needs to be replaced. And so that's the same thing that happened with those 44 footers. By the late 1980s, the Coast Guard was looking to replace them, and they were becoming hard to maintain. And also, technology in the 80s was far outpacing them. So the Coast Guard designed a new 47-foot motor lifeboat, this time made of aluminum, still with twin engines. And with the advances in the 1980s in terms of electronics and even engineering, they gave it a little bit different hull design so it could be faster, more maneuverable, and could take breaking seas a little bit more safely for the crew. And so today, this 47-foot motor lifeboat class is what the Coast Guard uses and what Surfmen operate. So in the span of like 200 years or less, we've seen this arc from wooden oar-powered open surf boats all the way to these complex twin-engine steel or aluminum motor lifeboats like the 47 and the 52-footer that I'll show you here. This is it's a short video, and it's kind of a cool one for us to check out because it's so beautifully done. Like what drones have allowed us to capture is really impressive. But everything we see here essentially has been done for 200 years with wooden boats and then the early motor lifeboats and now these ones. So we're kind of actually taking a look back in time and getting an idea of what this work would have looked like, just maybe a little bit slower with the oar-powered boats. And what we're seeing here is training. This is a huge part of what the Coast Guard does. It's just a lot of training. And for this surf work, for this heavy weather type of operations, there's kind of a playbook, and there always has been. You know, there's something that needs to happen in the surf. We need to pick a person up out of the water, or we need to retrieve a disabled vessel. So this playbook is kind of like there's a play for how to get into the surf. There's a play for how to station keep and hold position. There's a play for how to do that man overboard recovery. There's a play for how to move in the surf zone or how to avoid waves, and then a play for how to get out. So that's kind of what we're seeing here is all these different plays that get practiced. It's also interesting because those 47 footers, you know, are about 20 years old when this video was taken. And that white boat, the 52-foot motor lifeboat, one of only four in the Coast Guard, was close to 60 years old. So almost a working antique, if you will. So we've talked a bit about the service, and we've talked a bit about the boats, and I think we can come back to talking about the surfmen and kind of integrating all of these three pieces. So just to kind of refresh, initially these folks were volunteers, and then in the early life-saving service, they were called surfmen formally, and then kind of fell into that system of a station with a keeper and 6 or 8 surfmen. But initially, that service was pretty young, and they didn't even have uniforms. So one of the things that started happening was at a number of different places in the country, when a shipwreck would happen, these lifesavers would row out to the boat, and they actually got turned away because the crew thought that they were like pirates coming to loot them. And so a number of different stations individually came up with unique uniforms for their crews. Like this is one example. But eventually, by the 1890s, the service came up with a standard uniform and a standard insignia. So these are some of those uniforms, and you can see on the right sleeve of some of these guys that insignia, which is a life ring with a crossed boat hook and oar. And then you can also see on the opposite sleeve, on the second from the right fellow there, he has a number 2, and that corresponded to his kind of rank on the crew. Eventually, each of these surfmen were given a number from 1 to 8, and that dictated who was most senior and also who did what jobs during each of these different drills, whether it was the launching the lifeboat, recovering from a capsize, shooting the line out to rig up the breeches buoy, etc. By the turn of the 20th century, this was kind of the heyday of the life-saving service, but their crew structure and their equipment hadn't changed a whole lot. So the best that they had was pretty much oilskin slickers and cork life jackets throughout the decades that the life-saving service existed. And then a big change happened in 1915. I know I've talked about the Coast Guard and the life-saving service, and this is the point where the life-saving service was merged with another federal organization called the Revenue Cutter Service. It was like a customs and law enforcement agency. And together those became the U.S. Coast Guard, which is the branch of the military that we have today. But for these lifesavers, initially nothing really changed. This is a picture probably right after that change happened of a crew from the Washington coast. And for them, really the only thing that was different was their hats. The band on it changed from saying U.S. Life-Saving Service to U.S. Coast Guard. But into the next 5 or 10 years, things did start to change a little bit. So into the 20s, the Coast Guard started streamlining itself more and more with the form of the Navy, which they've kind of always been like the forgotten stepchild of. And so they started, for example, incorporating the Navy's system of ranks and rating, or like job specialty is what it is. And so where it had been throughout the history of the life-saving service and in the early Coast Guard that there was a keeper and then 6 or 8 surfmen, now it started to be that there was one surfman and it was a petty officer of a certain rank. And then eventually it became that the only surfmen formally, at least as they were called, were the most junior people, and everyone else was a petty officer with a particular specialty. And that kind of makes sense because as the Coast Guard grew, they didn't just have oar-powered boats, they had motor-powered vessels, and so they had ratings, job specialties for the people who ran the boats and maintained them, and they also had job specialties for people who had been trained in maintaining and operating machinery. So as this evolution continued into the 20s and 30s, the only surfmen at these stations were technically the most junior people in terms of the titles that were used. And the other thing that had happened was that initially the U.S. Coast Guard kept the life-saving separate from the law enforcement side of things, and so they designated a life-saving branch, and these stations all fell into it. But by the end of World War II, the Coast Guard streamlined again, and they merged and subsumed those two branches, and it became just one Coast Guard. And so where initially the people at those life-saving stations, they continued to work there and stay there as they always had. They didn't transfer around a lot. Once it became one Coast Guard, those folks were transferring to other states, and they were transferring to ships even. And then conversely, people from ships were transferring into the stations at the coast. So there was kind of a loss of corporate knowledge and a loss of local expertise that had for decades been maintained by people who were, whether they were family lines or not, they were working in the same places for years and years. And the other change that happened with that dissolution of the life-saving branch of the Coast Guard was that by the end of World War II, there were no more surfmen in the Coast Guard. They may have like used that term colloquially, but technically in the rank structure, those junior members who had once been called surfmen, they were just called seamen. And for the next couple of decades, there was nobody in the Coast Guard officially called a surfman anymore. Into the 1960s, just as things had happened with uniform changes and whatnot with the life-saving service, things continued to change with the surfmen. So you can see here, someone in the Coast Guard thought it was a good idea to probably start wearing helmets. And also they started experimenting with different types of hypothermia protective equipment. So the guy on the left there is wearing an early wetsuit to try and stay a little more comfortable and have a better chance of survival if they ended up in the water. The other thing that started happening in the 60s was that the Coast Guard took a little more formal approach to boat crew position certifications. So, like every time one of these lifeboats went out on a case, it was supposed to have a boat crew member who could do basic seamanship tasks and first aid and things like that, kind of run the deck on the boat. They'd also have an engineer who was responsible for the engines and doing rounds and making sure that everything was operating okay. And then there was an operator called a coxswain. And previously in the life saving service and in the early Coast Guard, the designation of those roles had kind of been informal. If the crew and the keeper all agreed that somebody was proficient enough, they were welcomed into the crew and they got underway. But starting in the late 60s, the Coast Guard came up with these discrete levels, kind of like different levels of license, like a tier of license. And they started training and they created some basic syllabi for certifying people at these different levels. So there were boat crew members, engineers, coxswains, and then for the most heavy weather and surf, they had these heavy weather qualified coxswains. So that was kind of a novel thing that happened at that time. But also at that time, with the advent of the new 44-foot motor lifeboat, there was kind of this mini crisis that was going on. There was a commanding officer who had spent his whole career running boats, and he served on both the East and the West Coast. And what he started noticing was that because that 44-foot motor lifeboat was so capable for its era, and because the transfer policies, the personnel policies after World War II, where station crews were being transferred everywhere, and people from everywhere else were being transferred back into these stations, he noticed that crews were kind of getting in over their heads, that the boat was almost too capable for their level of training and experience. So he requested an audience with the regional headquarters in Seattle and suggested that the Coast Guard establish a training school for these boat operators out at Cape Disappointment, Washington, which is where that very first video we watched of that rescue attempt occurred. And he got approval for it. So in 1969, the Coast Guard's Motor Lifeboat School was established and started training in the winter, training coxswains how to operate the 44-foot motor lifeboat in these really rough conditions. And that continued on for about 9 years, pretty well. In that time frame, I think we estimate that they trained about 1,200 coxswains, and I think people were noticing that the proficiency was increasing. But that early school was kind of poorly funded and always sort of a sideshow. It actually wasn't its own unit. It was kind of a feature of the search and rescue station at Cape Disappointment. And so during the months of the year that the school was in session, a number of people from the station actually had to kind of give up their station duties and report to the school to be instructors. And that school also never had its own boats. So it was always borrowing boats from the adjacent stations to have enough vessels to train students on. And you can imagine that when these stations were giving up their boats for several months, they probably weren't sending their pristine, best operating boats. So the school was getting boats that were kind of hard to maintain and sometimes had chronic problems. So with all those dynamics kind of under the surface moving forward, and also a lot of good work happening, in 1977, about 9 years into the school's run, there was a triple fatality that happened there involving a night training mission and a vessel capsizing and trapping some of the crew inside. And the story of this mishap requires like its own discussion and its own presentation. So I'll save that for another time, but it's the focus of the book that I wrote. And what I learned in researching it is actually that this mishap, almost more than a lot of other mishaps that have happened in the Coast Guard, really affected Coast Guard boat operations. And it really also affected this lineage of surfmen. And one of the biggest ways that it did that was 3 or 4 years after this accident, the Coast Guard took a look at that system of qualifications where it was the boat crew member, the engineer, and the coxswain, and it kind of revamped it and it made it more robust. It added training material and kind of took a new, fresh approach to it. And one of the things that they did with that is they maintained the boat crew, engineer, and coxswain levels, but they turned heavy weather coxswain into kind of 2 tiers. They kept a middle tier heavy weather coxswain who was a little more capable than a basic coxswain, and they added a new top level tier called surfman. So as a result of this accident, and that's, as we saw, as a result of everything else that evolved up to this point, the Coast Guard officially brought back the title of surfman in the early 80s. And the only thing really different about it this time was that before, where it was just kind of the name of somebody's position, like they generically were a surfman. What it became in the early 80s and what it remains today is a specific competency. So someone can be a petty officer in rank who qualifies as a surfman, and that's how it works today. After that accident and after those changes, things continued to improve in certain ways for the surfmen and for the boat crews of the Coast Guard. In the 80s and 90s, they started to get dry suits, which was a huge improvement. And I can speak firsthand to how wonderful they are. Um, but some of the underlying personnel problems that were threatening the experience and competence levels of these stations also persisted. And so in 1997, there was another accident out on the Washington coast where on a search and rescue case, a 44-footer went out. It was capsized a number of times and three of its crew were killed. And in kind of the hindsight of that and in analyzing that accident, the service really started to take a serious look at some of these underlying systemic issues that even to advance, like if somebody cared about their career and wanted to promote, they were required to leave the station where they were running lifeboats and go afloat on a big ship for a number of years. And so the baked into the system basically were these requirements that experience be diminished. There was also a lot of new focus put on risk management. And if you go back into the life-saving service, there were literally instances where keepers of crews were relieved for cowardice because they didn't make a rescue attempt. And there kind of was this unwritten saying that, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. Well, after this accident, the Coast Guard really had to push back on that kind of cultural messaging, which, in a first responder agency, it's kind of hard to tell people and to remind them to take a step back and slow down. But part of what they analyzed with this accident was that risk management needed to be emphasized more in this community. Another change that came from this accident as the Coast Guard started looking at risk management and changing some of these policies about transfers and assignments and whatnot was a felt need to emphasize and bring back some of the heritage of this surfman lineage and to also attract members to this tight community, which is a small community in the Coast Guard and a community that kind of gets locked into just doing that one job and often in these really remote places. And so they brought back the surfman check tradition, which is really ironic because initially it was this loathsome practice, but in the early 2000s, it came back as a ceremonial practice. And so today, if you qualify as a surfman, you're given a unique number and it's recorded in a register, and then you get a check with your number on it. As those changes after that 1997 accident were happening, of course, then we had all the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And so the Coast Guard has kind of continued to shift and evolve to keep pace with that. So today, as a surfman at one of these stations, certainly in the winter, you might be occupied with training and responding to cases in heavy weather. But the rest of the year, there's all kinds of job demands, paperwork, and all kinds of things, as well as law enforcement work. And at some stations, even homeland security duties like escorting high value vessels like container ships with certain stuff on board or cruise ships. Through this arc of surfmen and lifesaving and Coast Guard evolution, we've also seen a lot more women be integrated in this community. So it wasn't until actually 1974 that women could enlist in the Coast Guard. And then it wasn't until a few years later that they first certified as basic coxswains. And then we don't have an exact name or an exact date, but we think probably about 1977 or 1978 was the first time that a woman certified as a heavy weather coxswain, that early version, which basically converted into surfmen. And so since that point in the early 80s when surfmen kind of officially came back, there have been about 20 women who have certified as surfmen and who have even become instructors at the motor lifeboat school that was started in the 60s. And to kind of put a wrap on this, I'll just bring it up to the present and to give you an idea of what this whole community looks like today. The Coast Guard's entire small boat community consists of about 200 stations throughout the country, 19 of which are these surf stations, which are the places where surfmen are assigned and where the conditions are rough enough that they need motor lifeboats and numerous surfmen. But in the whole community of 200 stations, there's about 1,000 boats of different types, and there's about 6,000 people. standing duty, kind of on a firehouse schedule at both places where they're on duty for about 2 days straight and then off for about 2 days straight. Um, the caseloads at these stations in the past few years, the past decade or so, have declined a little bit. It's a kind of a good thing, right? The proactive measures of inspecting vessels, proactive laws for commercial fishing vessel safety, and just improvements in technology like navigation equipment has reduced a lot of the types of cases that the Coast Guard sees. So the challenge they have now is maintaining proficiency when there's, in some ways, less demand for some of the services that they've always provided. But to support that and to support that proficiency in the training, the Coast Guard still operates the National Motor Lifeboat School at Cape Disappointment. Um, Initially, that school only served people from Washington and Oregon, but in the years after that accident in 1977, they actually expanded, and today it's a national school that runs year-round and has a big budget and has 5 boats of its own, and is able to offer classes for basic coxswains, heavy weather coxswains, and surfmen. And they've really done some cool stuff to the point where now when students report in, they get issued a GoPro, like a little helmet cam, and an iPad, and they're actually recording their different runs that they do, so they can kind of like the pro sports model. They can debrief it afterwards. They can learn lessons, and they can share them with the rest of the students. I'll just kind of wrap here by mentioning my book, which talks about all of this and more in a lot of detail. So if there's anything that piqued your interest here, I promise there's something more for you in the book, including kind of the topic of mental health and recovering from trauma, because this community, all the way back to life-saving service, has been pocked with um, serious tragedies and loss of life, and people have done and seen a lot of really difficult things. And it's not always been a culture that knows how to talk about that or to help people get on with their lives after that happens. There's been a lot of just kind of suck it up. So anyway, if any of that piqued your interest, I encourage you to check it out. If you're in the Ocean City area, the Life Saving Station Museum has copies. If you're in Washington State, there's a bunch of local library systems that have it in circulation you can check out. Or you can always go on Amazon and pick it up there. But I will pause here. I really appreciate everyone's interest and attention today, and I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Well, thank you so much, John, for that really informative presentation. I know I learned quite a bit. So if anyone has any questions, you can add it to the Q&A box at the bottom. I can read them off. I know I have a question for you, John. When you entered the Coast Guard, did you learn about the life-saving service history? Was that incorporated at all? Because we find that we have to say pre-Coast Guard because the life-saving service as an entity is something that, not a lot of people tend to know about, but they know about the Coast Guard.
That's a good question. There's definitely boot camp is actually like a lot of classroom. You envision people just getting yelled at and doing push-ups and stuff, but a lot of it is like a basic education in the Coast Guard. And there's definitely classes that talk about, the revenue cutter service, which dates back to 1790, and the life-saving service and some of the notable people. But I think it all happens in such a flash that if people aren't really interested in it, they kind of forget about it. And even at the level of units that have had these stations for decades and longer and have had notable cases or notable accidents, people kind of just don't know about it. So I found in my research for this accident from 1977, I was stationed at Cape Disappointment, and like no one knew it happened. So that needing to talk about pre-Coast Guard makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
All right, well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. Give people a few more minutes. Up, here we go. So James asks, what was the actual year the surfman rank was reinstated?
So the short answer would be like 1982. the complex thing there is that's the year that that new system, uh, that new boat crew qualification system came out that officially had the surfman qualification level in it. What's tricky is that for from 1967 up to that point, there were a couple references in different Coast Guard manuals that I found to surfmen, but it wasn't officially assigned to anything. It was almost like somebody was kind of using an old term in a manual and not really knowing that it wasn't official anymore. So it's kind of a complex answer. The best I have is about 1982.
How long did it take you to produce and write your book?
Um, this is another complicated answer. The short answer is like 18 months. And most of that was research. And then by the time all the research was kind of wrapping up and stuff, it took me about 4 months to do the writing. But I've been researching this book for like seriously about 20 years. I was really interested in the Coast Guard from about age 6 onward, and didn't know that I was working on a project at the time, but kind of just started engaging in research as an adolescent. And when I was stationed in New Jersey, I went to the Coast Guard historian's office, and I went to the National Archives, and kind of was just accumulating photos and information and stuff. And when I officially started this book project, it was kind of like, oh, actually, I have all this momentum I've already built. So 18 months, but kind of a lifetime.
Well, thank you
Well,
everybody for joining us and for being a part of our Worcester County History Month programming. And thanks again to John for taking the time and giving a fantastic program. We really appreciate it.
thank you all so much. This is great. Great way to spend my morning.